Imagine a country where literally 100% of the population breathes toxic air
Yeah.
every single day. And I mean, not because they're surrounded by like heavy industrial mega factories or anything.
Or living next to some, gridlocked 8-lane highway.
Exactly. They are breathing this toxic air simply because mothers are, well, they're just trying to boil water to cook rice for their kids.
It's just basic survival.
Yeah, basic survival. Today, we are opening up a massive 64-year data vault to understand how a nation can be so thoroughly and systematically trapped by its own geography, its economy, and its invisible infrastructure.
We really want to bring you along for this.
Right, because you're here because you want to look past those, sensationalized 30-second news segments. You're insanely curious, and you want to truly understand these complex global realities without feeling totally overwhelmed by just a barrage of disconnected statistics.
Right.
So that is our mission today. Okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at a comprehensive 15-page analytical report.
Yeah, it's titled the Haiti National Comprehensive Indicator Analysis Report.
And it spans from 1960 to 2024.
It does. And that mission requires looking at, well, a completely different kind of timeline than we're used to.
How so?
Well, the brief headlines we usually see about this region, they really only capture the absolute peaks of a crisis.
Like the immediate aftermath of something.
Exactly. They show us the symptoms, like a riot, a collapsed building, a sudden shortage, but they rarely show us the underlying anatomy of the situation.
Yeah.
This isn't just a snapshot of today. This pulls, hundreds of data points from the World Bank, the UN, international organizations. And it covers 4 core dimensions: economic performance, human capital, governance efficacy, and the external environment.
Right off the bat, I really want to unpack that timeline.
Yeah.
Because 1960 to 2024, that is 64 years of data.
It's a massive scope.
It really is. When you look at most economic analyses, the focus is incredibly short-term. Like a 5-year projection here, a 10-year retrospective there.
Yeah.
Y is looking at a 6.5-decade timeline, an absolute necessity for this deep dive into the sources.
Because if you only look at, say, the last 5 or 10 years of data for any heavily impacted nation, you run the risk of falling into this massive analytical trap.
Okay, what kind of trap?
You might mistakenly conclude that a specific recent event, say a natural disaster or, a particular political crisis, is the sole isolated cause of the nation's struggles.
Ah, I see.
But a 64-year timeline reveals the structural, deeply rooted barriers. It allows us to see what economists call systemic vulnerability.
Systemic vulnerability.
Right. When you pan out to that macro level, you start to see that the crises of today are actually, they're echoes of unresolved vulnerabilities from decades ago.
It proves that the issues aren't just like anomalies or strokes of bad luck.
No, not at all. They are fundamentally baked into the architecture of the system.
It's kind of like the difference between looking at a single incredibly bad weather day and studying the entirely shifted long-term climate of a region.
Well, that's a great way to put it.
Like if you just look at the storm, you think, wow, that was a really bad storm. But if you look at the climate data over 60 years, you realize the environment has been like perfectly engineered to produce those exact devastating storms over and over again.
Exactly. We have to understand the climate to understand why the storms are so devastating. And the first dimension of this report, the macroeconomy, gives us the clearest picture of that climate.
Right.
When we look at the adjusted net national income and the GDP growth rates starting from the 1970s onward, the visual representation in the data is it's jarring.
Yeah, looking at this compound line chart on page 2, the best way I can describe it to you listening is that it looks like a seismograph during a major prolonged fault line rupture.
That's incredibly accurate.
The economic volatility is staggering. The growth rates fluctuate wildly. They're bouncing back and forth between positive and negative territory with a frequency and a severity that you almost never see in typical national economies.
No, you don't. It defies almost every traditional model of linear development.
Yeah.
We're pattern-seeking creatures, so we naturally look for that upward trend line over time. Right? The steady climb of industrialization that gives a society a sense of predictability.
But here, the trajectory is totally fractured.
Completely fractured. And your eye is immediately drawn to the massive extreme drop around 2010. There's a red circle around it in the report.
The 2010 earthquake.
Yeah. The data shows net national income absolutely plummeting.
Yeah.
And we have to consider the baseline here.
Right, it wasn't high to begin with.
Exactly. This wasn't a robust economy taking a hit. This was an already fragile national income of roughly $600 million entering a total free fall.
It's a literal cliff dive on the chart.
It is. But what's fascinating here is that the volatility itself isn't actually the most dangerous part.
Wait, really? The cliff dive isn't the worst part.
No. The true danger lies in how the society is structured to absorb that volatility.
Which brings us to the wealth distribution.
Yes.
When we look at the Gini coefficient data, that's the metric tracking inequality, it is terrifyingly high.
Off the charts.
The report breaks the population down into quintiles, which are just 20% chunks of the population.
Right.
The poorest 20% holds only a microscopic 6.1% of the national wealth.
6.1%. Let that sink in.
It's almost nothing. Meanwhile, the top 20% hoards the vast, vast majority. So, based on the stacking bar chart in the report, it seems like when the economy actually does manage a brief period of growth, the poor aren't even participating in it.
That is the cruelest mechanism of this entire economic structure.
Yeah.
Economists use the term external shock sensitivity to describe this. Because the wealth concentration is so extreme when the economy does grow, the financial benefits pool almost entirely at the very top.
So the top 20% captures all the surplus.
Exactly. They invest it, they move it offshore, they insulate themselves. The bottom 20% sees almost zero increase in their daily caloric intake, their housing stability, or their savings.
I want to push back on that a little bit, or at least explore the mechanics of it. Because in a highly volatile economy, doesn't everyone lose when the market crashes?
Well, technically, yes.
So why does the report frame this extreme inequality as a multiplier for the disaster rather than just like a separate issue?
Because you have to think about what living on 6.1% of the national wealth practically means for your daily survival mechanism.
Okay.
It means you have absolutely zero financial buffer.
Yeah.
You have no savings account. You have no insurance policies. Your entire economic existence is fundamentally hand-to-mouth.
Right.
So when a macroeconomic shock hits, whether that's a catastrophic earthquake, a sudden spike in global fuel prices, or a collapse in export demand, the national income drops by double digits.
Which hits everyone on paper.
Right. For the top quintile, that drop manifests as a loss in their investment portfolio value or reduced profit margins. It's a financial hit.
But for the bottom quintile?
For the bottom quintile, losing even 10% of their daily income means they physically cannot buy food the next morning. It transforms a macroeconomic downturn into an immediate, visceral humanitarian emergency. Every single time.
So there's no cushion at all?
None. An economy with this level of severe inequality is like a human body with a completely compromised immune system.
Oh, that's a chilling analogy.
A minor cold, like a slight dip in global export prices, doesn't just make the economy sniffle, it puts the entire system into multiple organ failure.
That immune system analogy really grounds it. If the economy is this erratic, volatile ecosystem with zero immune response, who are the people actually living inside it?
Right.
Because you can't really understand an economy without deeply understanding the demographics of the people trying to build it.
Absolutely. And the demographic data here presents one of the most complex, multi-layered challenges outlined in the entire analysis.
Yeah.
If we look at the population pyramid generated by the data on page 4, it is incredibly bottom-heavy.
Over 40% of the population is between 0 and 14 years old.
Yeah.
40%. That is a massive demographic bulge of children and young teenagers. And the report notes that this creates a crushing dependency ratio.
A high dependency ratio fundamentally alters the economic math of a household and a nation.
How so?
It means you have a very large number of people who are too young to work in the formal sector and pay taxes.
Right.
And they are entirely reliant on a relatively small working-age population to feed, clothe, and educate them.
But wait, here's where it gets really interesting to me. In a lot of international business reporting, a young population is usually talked about as this incredible, highly desirable asset.
Yes, the famous demographic dividend.
Exactly. You constantly hear that phrase. A youth bulge, it's supposed to be the future economic engine, the consumers, the innovators, the massive workforce of tomorrow.
That's the theory, yeah.
So why is the data in this report framing this 40% youth population almost like a demographic time bomb instead of a growth engine?
Because a youth bulge only translates into a demographic dividend if a society can meet two non-negotiable conditions.
Okay, what are they?
First, You must have the physical and institutional infrastructure to educate and keep those children healthy.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, you must have a dynamic labor market waiting to absorb them into productive formal jobs when they come of age.
And if you meet those
If
conditions,
you meet those conditions, that massive young population catapults your nation forward for decades. It's huge.
but if you don't have those systems in place,
Then the math inverses completely. You get a profound crisis of unmet expectations and desperate daily needs.
wow.
This massive youth population requires immediate, intense, front-loaded investment in healthcare and education. And the longitudinal data clearly shows that those foundational systems are fundamentally bottlenecked.
Let's trace that bottleneck starting with the very beginning of life healthcare.
Right.
The data on under 5 child mortality has, thankfully, decreased since its absolute peak in the 1960s. That is one of the rare positive trend lines we see on page 5.
It is, yeah.
But the report is quick to point out that it remains dangerously unacceptably high compared to basic global averages. And the mechanics of why it remains so high are explicitly mapped out.
The system just does not have the bandwidth to function.
Yeah, we have to look at the physician-to-patient ratio.
It's staggering.
The data indicates there are roughly 0.1 to 0.2 physicians for every 1,000 people.
Just think about that.
I really want you listening to visualize that number. 0.1 to 0.2 doctors for every 1,000 people.
Yeah.
Imagine a town of 10,000 people. In a robust system, you'd have dozens of doctors, specialists, clinics. Here, for those 10,000 people, you might have 1 or 2 trained physicians.
That's it, 1 or 2.
That falls so drastically short of international standards that it almost ceases to be a functional medical system.
When the ratio is that skewed, preventative care completely ceases to exist.
It's just triage, right?
Entirely. The medical infrastructure is entirely consumed by absolute triage. This is exactly why the data shows communicable diseases and perinatal conditions issues surrounding pregnancy and childbirth remaining as incredibly high causes of mortality.
Because there's no one to catch the problems early.
Exactly. If a child falls severely ill with a waterborne disease, the sheer mathematical probability of getting them in front of a trained medical professional in time is incredibly low. The doctors simply cannot physically see enough patients.
So if a child navigates that incredibly precarious healthcare environment and actually survives, they enter the education system.
Right, the next bottleneck.
And this is where the human capital crisis really compounds. The report flags a dire systemic literacy crisis.
Very bleak.
Depending on the specific cohorts and the years the data was cut, adult literacy metrics have occasionally hit single-digit lows, hovering around 6% in some historical tracking.
6% literacy.
But the visual that absolutely stuck with me from this report on page 6 was the funnel graph illustrating schooling retention.
The attrition rate is one of the most profound indicators of systemic failure in the entire report.
I mean, when you look at the funnel graph for enrollment at grade 1, it's relatively wide at the top. Kids are showing up.
Yeah, parents want their children to learn. They are entering the system.
But then the funnel aggressively, violently narrows. There are red X's marking the drop-offs. By the time the data tracks kids reaching the 5th grade, the dropout rate is absolutely devastating.
They just vanish.
Yeah, they don't just struggle, they simply disappear from the educational system.
And we really have to ask about the mechanics of that disappearance. Why are they dropping out before they're even 10 or 11 years old?
Right, what's pulling them out?
It certainly isn't a lack of desire to learn. It ties directly back to that economic volatility and the lack of an immune system we discussed earlier.
Oh, because when a family is living in that bottom 20% and an economic shock hits?
Precisely. If food prices spike 20% globally, that family can no longer afford the ancillary costs of schooling.
Like uniforms and books?
Uniforms, books, transport. But more critically, the opportunity cost becomes too high.
What do you mean?
A 10-year-old in a classroom is a pair of hands that the family desperately needs in the informal labor market just to secure that day's calories.
Oh, wow.
The macroeconomic shock physically pulls the child out of the classroom and onto the street to sell goods or work in unregulated agriculture.
So this interrupted schooling means that massive 40% youth bulge is going to enter adulthood without basic literacy, without marketable formal skills,
Exactly.
and they will be stepping into an economy that isn't generating formal jobs anyway.
It completely short-circuits any possibility of a demographic dividend.
It's awful.
It turns what should be an engine of human capital into a massive source of profound social instability.
Right, because they have nothing.
When you have millions of young, energetic people who are entirely locked out of the formal economy and feel completely disenfranchised from the political process, you have the historical recipe for chronic, generational unrest.
Which leads us to the most difficult, but arguably the most important question of this entire deep dive.
Yeah, getting to the root.
We've looked at the symptoms, we've seen the struggling hospitals with no doctors, the classrooms emptying out before the 5th grade, the erratic wealth charts where the bottom 20% starve during a downturn.
The symptoms are clear.
Now, the report forces us to look at the disease causing all of this. We have to talk about the invisible infrastructure.
Page 7 of the report is arguably the most sobering section of the entire 64-year analysis.
It really is.
It looks at the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI. These are standardized global metrics used by international organizations to benchmark how a state functions.
And for Haiti, specifically in 3 absolutely vital categories: control of corruption, government effectiveness, and rule of law, the metrics are practically non-existent.
Just completely flatlined.
To give you an idea of the scale we are talking about, most of these indicators sit below the 10th percentile globally.
Below the 10.
Yeah. Some hit extreme critical lows, like the 5.1 percentile rank. In certain historical tracking periods, we see values plunging down to a 0.4.
0.4.
It is a total statistical collapse of governance metrics. You look at the radar chart on page 7, and the lines they barely leave the center dot.
And it is crucial to understand that the report draws a very direct, unignorable causal line here.
Right.
It explicitly states that this systemic governance failure is the absolute root of all the other socioeconomic problems we've discussed. It is the core mechanism of the failure.
I want to pause here and be incredibly clear because the report is very careful about this, and we need to be as well.
Absolutely.
We are looking strictly at the systemic longitudinal data provided by these international tracking organizations. We aren't analyzing specific political figures, we aren't naming administrations, and we aren't taking a side on internal political debates.
No, we're just reading the instruments.
Right. The data itself is simply impartially recording a systemic structural vacuum that spans decades.
And that systemic vacuum creates what the analysts define as the vulnerability trap.
I really want to unpack how this trap works, because the concept of an invisible infrastructure perfectly explains why things don't get built.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you are trying to build a physical house for your family, but the local authorities randomly come and confiscate your bricks.
Right.
Or worse, there are no authorities at all, so an armed group takes your bricks and there is no police force to call.
A total vacuum.
Exactly. And on top of that, a massive hurricane blows away the foundation every few years. After a while, the rational economic choice is to simply stop trying to build.
That is the exact psychological and economic mechanism of capital flight.
Capital flight.
Right. Capital, whether it is domestic savings or foreign direct investment, is inherently cowardly. It flees from uncertainty.
That makes total sense.
The rule of law, the control of corruption, it isn't just some political abstract for academics to debate. It is the invisible infrastructure of a functional society.
It's the assurance that if you sign a contract, someone will actually enforce it.
Exactly. It's the certainty that property rights will be respected, so if you buy a piece of land to farm, someone else can't just claim it tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's the bureaucratic mechanism that ensures a tax dollar collected in the capital, actually, physically reaches the local clinic in a rural province to pay that single doctor's salary.
And when that invisible infrastructure evaporates.
Everything tangible, the hospitals, the schools, the electrical grid, the roads, inevitably crumbles.
And the report shows how this vulnerability trap is drastically compounded by natural disasters.
This is a vital distinction the data makes. A hurricane or an earthquake is a natural hazard. It is a geological or meteorological event.
Right, you can't stop the earth from shaking.
No, you can't. But a hurricane destroying an entire region, killing thousands of people because there were no building codes enforced, no emergency response systems funded, and no disaster relief coordinated.
That's a different story.
That is a governance failure.
Yeah.
The natural hazard triggers the event, but the profound lack of governance creates the disaster.
Wow. Wow. So we have this massive youth population. The traditional systems are failing them. Formal schooling is interrupted. Healthcare is a statistical improbability, and the invisible infrastructure of governance is paralyzed.
Yes.
How are everyday people actually surviving? How are they navigating this landscape to make a living and connect with the world?
That brings us to a deeply fascinating and highly contradictory dynamic outlined in the data. We have to look at the digital reality versus the financial reality.
Oh, this part was wild. The report shows that internet usage has jumped incredibly impressively.
It really has.
It went from essentially 0% in the early data sets to about 39.2%. Cell phone penetration has grown massively. People are connected to the network.
But the corresponding financial data reveals a massive wall.
Right.
While 39% have internet access, bank account ownership remains incredibly, stubbornly low.
I want you to really think about the daily friction of this paradox. Imagine you are a 22-year-old in that demographic bulge. You have a smartphone. You can get online.
You're seeing the whole world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can literally see the entirety of the global economy on your screen. You can go on YouTube and learn graphic design. You can find a client in New York or Paris on a freelance platform.
Yeah.
You are fully tapped into the digital zeitgeist.
Yeah.
But the moment that client says, "Great work, where do I wire the money?" the entire globalized illusion shatters.
Use breaks down.
You don't have a 9-digit routing number. You don't have a Swift code. You are digitally connected but financially exiled.
We call this the digital financial mismatch. And it is one of the most frustrating bottlenecks for grassroots economic development.
It has to be.
A smartphone without access to digital financial services is just a window to look through. It is not a door to walk through. It traps vast amounts of entrepreneurial energy.
Because you can't build a verifiable business.
Right. You might have a brilliant idea for a micro-enterprise, maybe aggregating local agricultural products to sell in the city.
Okay.
But without a formal bank account, you cannot access microcredit to buy a delivery truck. You cannot build a credit history to show you are reliable.
You're stuck.
You cannot securely save your profits without risking physical theft. You are forced to operate 100% in cash, day by day.
Which means you are forced to operate entirely in the informal sector.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what the labor market data reflects on page 11. The vast majority of human labor in this economy is trapped in low-productivity agriculture and the urban informal service sector.
And to illustrate how this labor moves, the analysts use a Sankey diagram.
Let's explain that for a second. For listeners who might not work with data visualization daily, a Sankey diagram uses arrows of different widths to show the flow of a quantity from one state to another.
Right, they look kind of like branching rivers.
Exactly. In this case, it's visualizing the flow of human lives and labor.
So imagine a thick, wide river of human labor flowing out of rural agricultural areas, people leaving the countryside.
And in a traditional development model, you would hope that this river is flowing toward high-skill, high-wage manufacturing jobs or tech jobs in the urban centers.
You hope it's an escalator moving up.
Right.
But the Sankey flow here shows something deeply troubling. People are abandoning low-yield, highly vulnerable agricultural work, only to flow directly into the urban, informal service sector.
They're moving from rural poverty to become street vendors, day laborers, or unregulated domestic workers in the city.
They aren't climbing an economic ladder at all.
No.
They're just stepping horizontally onto a different, equally precarious rung. They are trading the vulnerability of crop failure for the vulnerability of urban street economics. There's virtually no upward mobility in this flow.
And we absolutely have to highlight the gender data woven into this section.
Oh, this is critical.
Because the burden of this informal labor, this horizontal stepping, falls disproportionately, crushingly on women.
The numbers are stark, and they reveal a tragic loss of potential.
Yeah.
A staggering percentage of women are categorized as being trapped in vulnerable employment. There's a circle around the high percentage of vulnerable female labor on page 11.
Right.
But what makes this so deeply frustrating is that if you look at the data from earlier in life, there is basic parity in primary school enrollment.
Right. I saw that. Young girls and young boys are starting out with relatively equal access to that very first step of education. The society is investing in them equally at age 6.
But that early equality completely vanishes as they age into the structural realities of the economy. The systemic barriers later in life are immense.
The report points out a massive chasm in political power.
Huge.
There is an abysmal, negligible level of female representation in parliament and upper government echelons. And down on the household level, there is a heavy, vastly disproportionate burden of unpaid domestic work.
This raises a really critical point about the macroeconomic return on investment in human capital.
What do you mean?
Well, if a society invests the meager resources it has to educate a young girl, but then the structural reality of the labor market forces her into an unregulated, vulnerable street vending job,
Yeah.
while simultaneously loading her with 6 to 8 hours of unpaid care work, fetching water, caring for the sick, cooking every single day, her potential to contribute to the formal economy or to political leadership is completely suffocated.
It's just wasted.
The society is essentially hamstringing half of its intellectual and leadership potential.
Okay, so let's zoom out and look at the macro mechanics again.
Sure.
If the internal engine of the economy is this fundamentally broken, if the labor is trapped in the informal sector, the governance is paralyzed, the wealth is hyper-concentrated at the top, and half the population is burdened with unpaid survival tasks, what is keeping the country functioning at a basic biological level?
What's coming from outside?
Yeah, what is coming in from the outside?
That leads us to the external lifelines: trade dependency and foreign aid. Pages 9 and 10 of the report map out exactly how physically dependent the nation is on the outside world for its daily survival.
Let's start with the trade data. There is a gargantuan gaping void between exports and imports. It is a massive trade deficit.
Huge.
On the export side, the data shows they are mostly sending out tourism services, when it's safe enough for tourism and primary raw agricultural goods.
But look closely at the import side.
Okay.
The nation is highly, dangerously dependent on importing basic food and consumer goods. They are importing their caloric baseline.
I need to stop and ask about the mechanics of that, because that sounds terrifying.
It is.
If you rely on the outside world for your daily bread, literally the wheat, the rice, the cooking oil your population eats, you become completely vulnerable to things happening thousands of miles away that you have zero control over.
It connects right back to that lack of an economic immune system we talked about earlier.
Right.
If there is a supply chain crisis in the global shipping industry, or a sudden spike in maritime insurance rates, or, a drought in a wheat-producing nation halfway across the globe, the cost of a basic meal in Port-au-Prince skyrockets overnight. The country has no domestic agricultural buffer to absorb global inflation. They import the inflation directly onto the dinner plates of the bottom 20%.
Which brings us to the financial lifeline that attempts to plug these massive systemic gaps: official development assistance, or ODA.
Foreign aid?
Foreign aid. The data shows this peaking massively in 2010.
At over $3.2 billion.
Because of the international response to the earthquake.
Right.
Now, in almost any business model, an injection of $3.2 billion would be a massive catalyst for long-term growth. But the report argues that this dynamic actually hurts long-term fiscal planning.
It does.
How is that possible? How does billions of dollars in aid become a negative structural force?
This introduces a heavily debated concept in development economics known as aid dependency syndrome.
Aid dependency syndrome.
And we have to look at the timeline to understand it. The data trend over the long term shows a very specific reactive pattern. The report describes the aid as highly event-driven. It lacks a long-term, sustainable mechanism.
It's a double-edged sword.
Completely.
On one hand, the aid is a literal, immediate lifeline. It provides emergency food, it drops in medical supplies, it physically keeps the macroeconomy breathing. You cannot simply withdraw it without causing an immediate catastrophic wave of human suffering.
No, you can't. But on the other hand, the event-driven nature of this aid creates a perverse structural incentive. It fundamentally alters how the government operates.
How so?
The aid spikes massively when there is a highly visible disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane that makes global news. But then, as the news cycle inevitably moves on, the donor attention fades and the aid drops off a cliff.
It's entirely reactive. It's treating the symptom, not building the infrastructure.
Exactly. And we have to look at how this money enters the country. Because the local governance is ranked so low in those WGI metrics we looked at earlier, because of the corruption and inefficiency foreign donors from places like Canada, the U.S., and Japan, they often bypass the local government entirely.
So where does the money go?
They give the money to international NGOs.
And that creates a parallel system.
Exactly. And think about what that parallel system does to the local capacity. If you were one of those rare, highly trained local doctors, one of the zero point 0.1 per thousand,
Yeah.
do you work for the desperately underfunded public Ministry of Health, where your paycheck might not arrive for months? Or do you take a job with a well-funded foreign NGO that pays in U.S.
You
dollars?
take the NGO job, you have to feed your family.
Right. So the foreign aid inadvertently drains the best local talent out of the public sector, further hollowing out the state's capacity to ever build its own healthcare system.
Oh man, and it completely bypasses the social contract between the government and the citizens.
It really does.
If a government gets its operating budget from foreign capitals instead of from taxing a productive local economy, they are financially accountable to the foreign donors, not to the citizens on the street.
Right. The government spends its time writing grant proposals to foreign embassies instead of building a domestic tax base.
That is the insidious core of aid dependency syndrome.
It keeps the patient alive on life support, but the very nature of the life support system prevents the patient's own organs from ever learning to function independently.
Wow.
How can a Ministry of Health plan a 10-year hospital building program if they have absolutely no idea what their budget will be next year, because it relies entirely on the unpredictable generosity of foreign capitals responding to the latest disaster?
They can't. It's a heavy, profound realization. But we have to look at one more dimension before we can even begin to talk about solutions.
The physical environment.
Yes, because while we've been talking about the abstract economic and political climate,
Yeah.
the literal physical environment is buckling under the weight of this poverty. The poverty has a physical toll.
Page 13 of the report covers the environmental degradation, and it is a stark reminder that extreme poverty has an immense ecological footprint.
The report highlights a continuous, severe depletion of forest cover. But it's the air quality data connected to that deforestation that absolutely stopped me in my tracks.
The PM 2.5 levels.
Yeah. Systemic energy shortages across the entire country, the failure of the electrical grid, have led to a desperate population-wide over-reliance on biomass energy.
Meaning charcoal.
Meaning people are cutting down the remaining trees to make charcoal just to be able to cook their daily food.
And the consequence of that survival tactic is horrifying. The report states that 100% of the population is exposed to PM 2.5 levels that wildly exceed World Health Organization guidelines.
100%. Every single person breathing the air.
PM 2.5 refers to microscopic, fine particulate matter. When you cook with charcoal or wood in poorly ventilated spaces day after day, year after year, you are inhaling massive amounts of this toxic particulate.
It just coats everything.
It penetrates deep into the lungs and enters the bloodstream.
I want to slow down here because it's so easy to just read that as a sterile statistic. 100% exposure.
Right. It loses its meaning.
But think about the human element, the daily reality. Every single person is breathing toxic air, not because of some greedy corporate industrial factory bypassing regulations, but because of basic, undeniable survival needs.
Because a mother needs to boil water to make it safe for her children to drink, and she needs to cook rice so they don't starve.
The act of keeping her children alive today is poisoning their lungs for tomorrow.
It perfectly synthesizes everything we've talked about into the ultimate physical manifestation of the vulnerability trap.
It really does.
Environmental degradation here is not some abstract, future-focused climate change debate.
Oh.
It is a severe, immediate public health crisis causing widespread respiratory diseases right now.
And it feeds right back into the economic disaster. It closes the loop of the vulnerability trap.
Yeah, trace the loop.
Poverty forces people to cut down trees to make charcoal because the state can't provide electricity. Cutting down the trees ruins the air they breathe, making them sick, which puts pressure on a medical system that only has one doctor for every 10,000 people.
Exactly.
But it also removes the vital root systems holding the topsoil together on the hillsides.
Which means when the seasonal tropical rains that are a totally normal part of the weather pattern, the land cannot absorb the water.
It just runs right off.
The soil washes away. A normal rainstorm becomes a catastrophic, fatal mudslide.
Which destroys their homes, wipes out whatever meager agricultural yields they have, and plunges them right back into the absolute deepest end of the poverty spectrum.
Requiring more event-driven foreign aid just to survive the week, the trap completely closes on itself.
It is a devastating cycle, but the report doesn't just leave us in the dark with the data. It outlines a roadmap.
It does. The analysts are clear that while the historical data is grim, the mechanics of the solution do exist.
We promised you, our listener, that we wouldn't just give you the overwhelming problems, we'd give you the insights and the path forward.
Right.
So let's look at the solutions. Page 15 of the report gives us 3 core policy recommendations to break this 64-year cycle.
The first, and the absolute prerequisite to everything else, is strengthening governance. You cannot solve the other problems without this.
You cannot build the house until you secure the foundation.
Precisely. It means tackling corruption, establishing a predictable rule of law, and building that invisible infrastructure.
Right.
It means creating a system where a contract is honored and property rights are secure, so that domestic entrepreneurs and foreign capital feel safe enough to invest long-term.
Because if they don't feel safe,
Without this foundational stability, no amount of foreign aid money will ever stick. It will just wash away in the next crisis.
the second recommendation is a massive targeted investment in human capital. We have to go back to that youth bulge, that 40% of the population under 14 years old.
That demographic is the ultimate glimmer of hope in this entire report.
How so?
You have a massive generation of young people who, despite the lack of bank accounts, are increasingly digitally connected and aware of the global landscape.
They're on the internet.
Right. If the foundational governance can be stabilized just enough to funnel real resources into consistent education and preventative health care, that youth bulge transforms from a looming time bomb into a highly productive, dynamic workforce.
And the third recommendation is economic diversification, breaking the addiction.
Moving away from the heavy reliance on single-source imports for basic survival and breaking the cycle of event-driven aid.
It means building sovereign resilience, investing deeply in domestic climate-resilient agriculture so you are growing the caloric baseline at home rather than being held hostage by global wheat prices and shipping container costs.
Exactly.
So we've unpacked the roller coaster economy and the extreme wealth concentration. We've looked at the demographic challenges, the crushing lack of doctors, and the funnel of disappearing education.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We explored the governance vacuum, the digital paradox of smartphones without bank accounts, the heavy reality of aid dependency, and the environmental toll of the charcoal economy.
We've seen the symptoms, but more importantly, we've explored the structural root causes.
And we've seen that the solutions, while incredibly complex and requiring generational commitment, are mathematically and structurally possible.
They are.
But I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over on your own. It's something that really builds on everything we've discussed, especially regarding those external lifelines.
It is the ultimate, incredibly uncomfortable paradox of international intervention.
If international aid, by its very nature and its parallel structures, inherently creates economic dependency and hollows out local government capacity, but withdrawing that aid tomorrow would cause an immediate catastrophic wave of starvation and humanitarian collapse. How does the global community ethically restructure its relationship with a deeply vulnerable nation?
How do you change the tires on a car while it's still driving down the highway at full speed?
Exactly. It's a question that challenges the entire foundational framework of modern global development. It forces us to ask what true partnership actually looks like.
It really does.
And it's one we hope you'll keep exploring long after this conversation ends. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, for taking the time to look past the chaotic headlines, and for wanting to truly understand the data. Keep asking the hard questions and stay insanely curious.